A single man, a single afternoon, a few dry sticks pulled from the desert floor, and a sentence so heavy that the entire camp of Israel, hundreds of thousands of people, gathered in silence to carry it out. He did not steal, he did not kill, he did not curse God. He gathered wood, and for that stones were placed in the hands of an entire community. This is the story of the wood-gatherer of the Sabbath, and of the day heaven itself gave the order. You have probably heard about the Ten Commandments. You have probably heard about the Sabbath as a day of rest. But almost no one tells you what happened in the second year after the Exodus from Egypt, in the wilderness of Paran, when a nameless man was caught doing something that seems, to modern eyes, completely trivial. The text is short, only 5 verses. The book of Numbers, chapter 15, verses 32 to 36. And yet those 5 verses hide one of the most disturbing passages of the entire Torah, one that theologians, rabbis, and historians have debated for more than 3,000 years. To understand what happened, you need to travel back in time, approximately 1,445 years before Christ, according to the traditional biblical chronology. The people of Israel had left Egypt roughly 2 years earlier. They walked through a landscape of stone and sand, where the daytime temperature reached 50 degrees Celsius, and the nighttime temperature dropped below zero. Around 600,000 men of fighting age, according to the census of Numbers, chapter 1, verse 46. Add women, children, and elders, and modern scholars estimate a total population between 1,500,000 and 2,400,000 people, a moving nation, a city with no walls, dragging itself through the wilderness. And in the middle of that mass of humanity, one man decided to gather sticks on a Saturday. The Hebrew text uses a specific verb, mekoshesh. It means to collect, to bundle, to pick up scattered pieces of dry wood from the ground. He was not chopping down a tree, he was not building anything, he was simply picking up sticks, perhaps for a fire, perhaps to cook, perhaps to warm his tent during the freezing desert night. The text does not tell you his name, it does not tell you his tribe, it does not tell you his age. It gives you only the action and the consequence. There is something you need to understand before going further. The Sabbath was not just a Jewish tradition, it was not a cultural preference. It was, in the theological framework of Israel, the visible signature of a covenant. The word Sabbath, Shabbat in Hebrew, comes from a root that means to cease, to stop, to interrupt. In the book of Exodus, chapter 31, verses 13 to 17, God tells Moses that the Sabbath is a perpetual sign between him and the people of Israel. Not an ordinary law, a sign, a mark, a visible flag of belonging. Whoever violated it was, in the language of the text, breaking the covenant itself, and the penalty was already established. Exodus chapter 35 verse 2 states with brutal clarity, "Whoever does any work on the 7th day shall be put to death." The commandment already existed, the penalty already existed. What did not yet exist was a concrete case, a precedent, a moment when the theoretical law would face a specific human being. The wood-gatherer became that moment. Imagine the scene. Imagine the wilderness at the end of the 6th day, when the sun begins to descend behind the ridges of orange stone and the shadows stretch long over the sand. The camp was organized with military precision. 3 tribes to the north, 3 to the south, 3 to the east, 3 to the west. In the center, the tabernacle, the sacred tent, protected by the Levites. The evening horn had already sounded. The Sabbath had already begun. And in that moment of collective silence, when families gathered around their tents and no fires could be lit, a man walked out into the desert with empty hands and returned with a bundle of sticks under his arm. He was seen. The text says he was found. The Hebrew verb used, matzah, implies discovery in the act. Witnesses saw him. They did not act alone. They did not stone him on the spot, even though the penalty was already known. They took him first to Moses, and to Aaron, and to the entire congregation, because there was a doubt. Not about the fact. The fact was clear. The doubt was about the exact application of the sentence. How should he die? Where? Who should throw the first stone? And more importantly, whether this specific action truly qualified as work in the sense forbidden by the covenant. And here you see something extraordinary, something that reveals a deep structural principle of the Torah. The text says, in Numbers chapter 15, verse 34, "And they put him in custody because it was not declared what should be done to him." Read that again. It was not declared. Moses, the greatest prophet of Israel, the man who had spoken with God face to face on Sinai, the legislator, the deliverer, hesitated. He did not know exactly how to proceed. He did not act on impulse. He did not use his authority to improvise a sentence. He did what any judge concerned with justice would do. He waited, he consulted, he asked. Days may have passed. The text does not specify. But the man remained in custody, guarded, isolated, while the community waited for a direct answer from heaven. And that answer came. It came with precision and with weight. In verse 35, God speaks to Moses, "The man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. Not one man, not a group of designated executioners, the entire congregation, everyone, collective responsibility, shared judgment, and outside the camp, because ritual impurity could not contaminate the space where the divine presence dwelled." The next verse describes the execution with a coldness that still causes shivers 3,000 years later. "And all the congregation brought him outside the camp, and they stoned him with stones, and he died, as the Lord commanded Moses." That is all. 6 words in Hebrew. He died. No details of agony. No description of the sound of stones striking flesh. No name of the executioner. Only the final fact. But you cannot stop there, because the question that emerges from that scene is the same question that has echoed through synagogues, churches, philosophy classes, and human hearts for more than 30 centuries. Why? Why the death penalty for gathering sticks? Why such disproportion between the small act and the enormous consequence? Why an infinitely merciful God, according to the same tradition that produced this narrative, would demand the life of a man over a bundle of dry wood? To answer, you need to enter the mental framework of the ancient world, and you need to abandon, for a moment, the modern assumption that all crimes must be measured by the amount of physical damage they cause. In Israel of the wilderness, the question was not just how much harm the man had done. The question was what his action represented, and what it would trigger if left unpunished. Think about the context. The Israelites had left Egypt only 2 years before. Egypt was a land of continuous labor. Slaves worked 7 days a week. There was no rest. There was no ceasing. The system devoured bodies with the same efficiency with which it built pyramids. Historians estimate that thousands of Hebrew workers died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and infection during the 4 centuries of slavery. The desert generation carried in their skin the memory of muscles ripped from continuous effort, of children born and buried in the same clay pits, of an economy that treated human beings as multi-purpose tools. The Sabbath was the exact opposite of that system. The Sabbath was the theological declaration that human beings were not tools. That work did not define human worth. That 1 day out of every 7 belonged not to production, not to survival, not to accumulation, but to a dignity that transcended labor. Every 7th day, the slave and the master ate the same bread. Every 7th day, the ox in the field and the child in the tent rested equally. It was a social revolution disguised as a religious commandment, and it needed to be defended with absolute rigor, because everything the people were leaving behind pulled them back. The wood-gatherer, whether he knew it or not, was doing more than picking up sticks. He was reopening a door that God had commanded to keep shut. He was, symbolically, saying that work continued to define time, that there was no true ceasing, that the Sabbath was optional, negotiable, adjustable to personal necessity, and if that door were opened once, without consequence, it would open again and again, until the sign of the covenant became invisible, until the difference between Israel and Egypt disappeared, until the memory of slavery faded and the theological revolution died in the crib. You see the weight now. The man was not being punished only for what he did. He was being punished for what his action would produce if it went unpunished. He became a boundary marker, a stone in the road, a warning inscribed with blood in the collective memory of the people. Whoever walked past that place in the coming decades would remember and would think twice before repeating the gesture. There is another layer deeper still that most modern readers miss. The Sabbath in the theological framework of Israel was not just a day of rest. It was a rehearsal, a weekly rehearsal for something greater. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, written centuries later, the anonymous author explains that the Sabbath points to a final rest, a definitive ceasing that will come at the end of history. Every Saturday, when the Hebrew family sat around the table without lit fire, without prepared food, without any labor, they were rehearsing eternity. They were, in a small and weekly gesture, prophesying a future when all suffering would cease and all labor would end. To violate the Sabbath in that framework was to break the rehearsal. It was to refuse to enter the promise. It was to declare in practice that the present of labor was more important than the promised future of rest. The wood-gatherer, without perhaps understanding it, was making a theological statement of enormous scope, and the response came at the same scale. But there is something you need to see with equal honesty. This narrative disturbs, and it should disturb. It disturbs the modern reader, it disturbed the ancient rabbis, it disturbed the medieval theologians, and it continues to disturb anyone who reads the text carefully today. The Talmud, in Tractat Shabbat, devotes pages to discussing this specific case. Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest sages of Judaism, taught that the man in question was Tzelofchad, mentioned later in Numbers chapter 27. Other rabbis rejected the identification. The debate never fully closed. And there is a reason for that discomfort, because the God of the biblical narrative is not a God who kills easily. Throughout the Torah, you find hesitation, delay, second chances. Nineveh was warned and repented, and God did not destroy the city. David committed adultery and murder and did not die. The people of Israel repeatedly worshipped idols and were not exterminated. The pattern of the text is one of patience, of long suffering, of extended opportunity. So when a case arises in which the sentence is immediate and inescapable, you need to ask why. The rabbinical answer, developed over centuries, is that this specific case was not really about a bundle of sticks. It was about the intentionality of defiance. The Hebrew tradition distinguishes between shogueg, someone who sins by ignorance, and mezid, someone who sins with full knowledge and deliberate intent. For the involuntary sinner, the Torah provides sacrifices, atonements, mechanisms of restoration. For the intentional and public defiant, especially in a case that put the entire covenant at risk, the response was categorically different. The context of the passage confirms this reading. In the previous verses, in the same chapter 15 of Numbers, verses 30 and 31, the text establishes exactly this distinction. Whoever sins with a high hand, that is, deliberately and defiantly, shall be cut off from the people. His iniquity shall be upon him. The case of the wood-gatherer appears right after this rule, functioning as a concrete illustration of what a sin with a high hand looks like in practice. The man had not gathered sticks in his tent in secret, hoping no one would see. He had gone out into the desert in broad daylight on a Sabbath, with the entire camp organized around him. His action was public, visible, unmistakable, and according to rabbinical interpretation, deliberate. He was not learning about the Sabbath for the first time. The commandment had been given more than a year earlier on Mount Sinai, with thunder and lightning and the sound of the shofar heard by 600,000 men. Every Israelite knew. Every Israelite had heard. His action was not ignorance, it was defiance. And yet, even with all these theological and legal explanations, something in the story continues to resist easy comprehension. Perhaps because you, reading now, cannot fully feel the weight that a Hebrew of the wilderness felt when hearing the word Sabbath. Perhaps because your world has already fragmented time to such an extent that the idea of a sacred day, an untouchable day, a day that stops everything, seems almost mythological. Perhaps because you already live in the Egypt that the Sabbath was designed to prevent. Think about your own week. Think about the last time you truly stopped, not stopped to consume entertainment, not stopped to scroll through screens, truly stopped, in silence, without production, without goals. Modern statistics show that the average worker in the industrialized world checks the phone approximately 144 times per day. The average day of continuous rest, without any form of work or digital consumption, has practically disappeared from the calendar of ordinary people. What the Torah demanded of Israel 3,000 years ago has become, in the 21st century, an act of civil disobedience against the culture. And perhaps that is why the story of the wood-gatherer, uncomfortable as it is, continues to force conversation, because it forces you to face a question that no century has managed to escape. What is a rhythm of life worth? What is a sacred day worth? What is a promise of rest worth? And what happens when a community decides that these things have no value at all? The desert wilderness, silent witness to that ancient execution, still exists. Modern geologists identify the region of Paran as a strip of desert between the Sinai and the Negev, an area of approximately 40,000 square kilometers of rocks eroded by heat and wind. It is a landscape that has changed very little in 3 millennia. The same silence, the same red stones, the same sand that swallows footsteps within hours. Somewhere in that immensity, according to the ancient text, a man was buried under a pile of stones and forgotten by name, but not by history. His nameless death entered the sacred canon of 3 world religions. Judaism, Christianity, and indirectly Islam read the same passage and grapple with the same questions. Medieval commentators wrote thousands of pages about this scene. Modern preachers avoid it or handle it with theological gloves. Skeptical philosophers use it as evidence against the biblical God. Devout believers use it as evidence of the seriousness of the divine covenant. And in the middle of all that noise, the man himself remains silent. He does not speak. He does not defend himself. He does not repent, at least not according to the text. He simply appears, gathers his sticks, is found, is judged, and dies. There is something profoundly human about that silence, because it forces the reader to fill the gap. What was he thinking? What did he feel when the witnesses approached? What did he say when brought before Moses? What did he see in the eyes of the neighbors who, days later, picked up the first stones? The Torah leaves all these gaps empty, and each generation of readers fills them with its own fears and its own convictions. The physical execution followed the standards of the time. Rabbinical tradition, developed in later centuries but based on ancient practices, describes the ritual with clinical detail. The condemned was taken outside the boundaries of the camp. Ritual purification would be done. Witnesses would be positioned first. According to Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 7, the hands of the witnesses would be the first to throw the stones, and only then the hands of all the people. The principle behind this rule was practical and moral. Whoever accused had to be willing to execute. There were no anonymous accusations. There were no risk-free denunciations. Whoever pointed the finger picked up the stone. And the entire people had to participate, not because heaven needed the collective violence to be efficient, but because the community needed to recognize itself as responsible for the maintenance of the covenant. Each family that threw a stone was, in some way, renewing its promise. Each hand that lifted a rock was declaring in silent gesture, "I too refuse to open this door." The execution happened, the man died, the camp returned to its tents, and the next Sabbath came 7 days later with the same silence, the same absence of fires, the same rest. But now the silence carried a new weight. Now everyone knew that the boundary was not symbolic, that the covenant was not decorative, that the sign written in the seventh day had been signed with blood. And there is a detail in the biblical text that almost no one notices, but that changes the entire reading of the passage. Immediately after the story of the wood gatherer, in the same chapter 15 of Numbers, verses 37 to 41, God commands Moses that the people of Israel wear tassels of blue thread on the corners of their garments, small threads, small blue knots, a visible reminder hung on the body of all the commandments of the Lord. The text says explicitly, "It shall be a tassel for you to look upon and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, so that you may not follow after your own heart and your own eyes." The proximity of the passages is not accidental. The narrator, whoever compiled the book of Numbers in its final form, deliberately placed the story of the executed man immediately before the commandment of the visible reminders. As if to say, the wood gatherer forgot. The wood gatherer allowed himself to be carried away by his own eyes and his own heart. Now everyone will wear a physical mark that prevents that forgetfulness from happening again. The blood of one man became, in the sacred narrative, the reason for the daily use of a symbol. This is the deepest reading of the passage, not the God who kills for pleasure, not the divine legalism disconnected from reality, but a specific historical moment when a fragile community, newly liberated, walking through a hostile wilderness, needed to inscribe in flesh and stone the difference between what it had been and what it was called to become. The Sabbath was the pillar, and the pillar could not be shaken. You will never know the man's name. You will never know why he decided to gather those specific sticks on that specific afternoon. You will never know if he acted out of hunger, out of coldness, out of stubbornness, out of despair, or out of pure defiance. The text refuses to give you that information, and there is something almost merciful in that refusal, because his anonymity turns him, in a way, into everyone. Into any person who, at some point, decides that the general rule does not apply to their particular case. Into anyone who calculates that a small transgression, one small time only, will bring no real consequence. The desert of Paran continues silent. The stones that killed the wood gatherer, probably rolled down slopes, were buried under layers of sand, were used by later Bedouins to build low walls of shelter. Nothing remains of him, not the tent where he slept, not the fire he wanted to light, not the bundle of sticks he gathered, only the 5 verses of Numbers chapter 15 and the endless discussion that those verses provoke every time they are read in the synagogues of the world. The 7th day arrives. Somewhere at this exact moment a Jewish family lights 2 candles on Friday evening. The mother covers her eyes and pronounces the ancient blessing. The father breaks the bread and blesses the wine. The children look at the flames and know, without needing explanation, that from that moment until the next evening, time changes. It slows, it deepens, it becomes something else. And in that domestic gesture, repeated for millennia, there is a distant echo of the man who died in the desert, because his death was not in vain. His death engraved in the collective memory of a people the seriousness of the seventh day. And perhaps this is the final legacy of the wood-gatherer, not the horror of the execution, not the theological weight of the sentence, but the strange permanence of a boundary that no other civilization has been able to preserve for so long. Empires have risen and fallen, cultures have appeared and disappeared, systems of counting time have been invented and abandoned. But every 7 days, in cities scattered across every continent, someone still lights a candle, stops, and remembers. The man in the wilderness did not know what he was doing when he gathered those sticks. He did not know that his action would echo through 30 centuries of theological reflection. He did not know that his anonymous death would be, paradoxically, the guarantee of a rhythm that would outlast every empire born after him. He did not see, he did not hear, he did not know. And yet the seventh day continues to come, every week, without interruption, without exception, since the beginning.